Throughout his life, Chavez was a devout Catholic. He spent usually an hour a day in prayer, attended Mass daily, but it was during moments of crisis where he turned to his favorite mystical vehicle, and that was fasting. Now, for those who don't know, fasting is an ancient spiritual discipline where one abstains from food and sometimes water to prepare themselves to see God more directly. And while running the everyday business of the Union, Chavez routinely fasted. He fasted from midnight till noon every day. Every couple of months, he would go 8 to 12 days without eating so he could understand God's will for his life more clearly. Think in your own life, when we go without food for one meal or a day, he would do it for 8 to 12 every 3 months. He's most famous for his 3 extended fasts. In 1968, Chavez went on a water-only fast for 25 days. He repeated that fast in 1972 for 24 days, and in 1988 for 36 days. For the popular press, and for many of the especially early scholars, these extended fasts were assumed to be protest fasts, hunger strikes, to call attention to a specific injustice. Chavez consistently and categorically stated otherwise. For him, they were deep religious exercises to discern the will of God. They were opportunities to ask for forgiveness and find time in prayer. He began to report that he would receive spiritual gifts, new perspectives, extrasensorial hearing, abilities of concentration. He even speaks of having a unifying vision of the world. He said, once I'm on a fast, I'm on a different level. Patience is infinite. Maybe that's what happens when you go on a fast. You get feeling so great you're not even afraid of death. And it was in the midst of these divine encounters that he made the critical movements for his social activism. His program of social change was guided by his fasting. He was placing his faith at the basis of his social action. And this connection is most evident in the words he gives at the end of his fast, and they're all very interesting, but they're decidedly religious in tone, content, and style. He speaks with the moral authority of a prophet, denouncing the kingdom of this world, proclaiming a new one under God. After his first extended fast, he was beside Bobby Kennedy, and he said the following words: "Our struggle is not easy. Those who oppose our cause are rich and powerful, and they have many allies in high places. We are poor, our allies are few, but we have something the rich do not own. We have our bodies, and the spirits and the justice of our cause as our weapons. When we are really honest with ourselves, we must admit that our lives are all that really belong to us. So it is how we use our lives that determine what kind of men we are. It is my deepest belief that only by giving our lives do we find life. I'm convinced that the truest act of courage, the strongest act of manliness, is to sacrifice ourselves for others in a totally nonviolent struggle for justice. To be a man is to suffer for others. God help us all to be men." These are the words of a deeply religious man who is embodied and now articulating the Christian ideal of a total self-sacrificing love for others. 500 years ago, he would have been seen as a saint. Today, the religious backdrop has largely been scrubbed from his story, and he's a secular hero. Chavez eventually dies in 1993 from complications of yet another fast to discern the will of God for him and for his movement. And ever since his death, there's been a battle to define his legacy. Most of the media and commentators leave out religion from his story. Chavez is presented as a social revolutionary, a radical driven by high philosophical ideals of justice and nonviolence. His fasts are protest fasts. His pilgrimages are protest marches. His motivations were not religious. In religious studies, we might call that a secularization of Chavez, taking religion out of the story. That is to say that Chavez's legacy is now a non-religious legacy for most. The prevalence of this narrative should remind us that every story has a story behind it. It's useful to think about the context in which our stories are told. Is there a political or cultural reason for a story to be told in a particular way? And of those who tell that dominant story, few recognize how contrary this secularized portrayal is to how Chavez saw himself. Because he was often asked what was his motivation, and he continually said it was his faith. He once said, "Today I don't think I could base my will to struggle on cold economics or some political doctrine. I don't think there would be enough to sustain me. For me, the base must be faith." And he feared that people wouldn't see his faith. In 1969, he says, "I don't think we can find total happiness in a purely economic struggle, regardless of how many benefits we may get. Not that these aren't important. I'd be the first to say they are important. But I think that if we divorced the struggle from religion, we would not be totally happy, even though we would make great gains." Despite that plea, that this divorce of Chavez's spirituality from his social activism is the distinguishing mark of his portrayal. This is why in religious studies, we need to retell that story from his perspective.